Marriage, among the titled families of England, was never a matter of the heart. It was a ledger entry, weighed in acres and settled in coin, and if a family had no dowry left to offer the world, they learned instead to offer humiliation, dressed up neatly and delivered in a sealed envelope to whichever great house could least afford to refuse it. Lady Beatrice Merrow understood this arithmetic better than any woman in Hertfordshire. She had built a second fortune out of other people's shame, quietly, patiently, the way some women embroidered. And on a grey morning in early autumn, she decided to spend the very last of her stepdaughter's dignity on the single, most reclusive, most feared, most thoroughly unmarriageable nobleman in the whole of the north of England. The breakfast room at Merrow House smelled of burnt toast and old resentment, the particular smell of a household that had learned to economize on everything except cruelty. Lady Beatrice sat at the head of the table in a morning gown, the colour of a bruise just beginning to heal. Her two daughters, Isabel and Cecily, arranged on either side of her like matching bookends chosen for their gilding rather than their contents. Verity Merrow stood by the sideboard as she always stood, because there had never been a fourth chair set for her at that table, not once in the 9 years since her father had died and left her, penniless and unclaimed by any living relation who wanted her, to the mercy of the woman who had married him for his house and buried him within 18 months of the wedding vows. "Sit down now." "Verity, you're hovering like a governess who has misplaced her charges," Lady Beatrice said, without looking up from the letter she was folding into a fresh envelope. Her voice carried the particular dangerous sweetness she reserved for the mornings she intended to do something truly cruel. "There is no chair for me, my lady," Verity said. It was not a complaint, it was simply a fact, stated the way she might have reported the price of candles. "So there isn't." Lady Beatrice smiled at the seal she was pressing into the soft red wax. A small, private, satisfied smile, and held the letter out without offering it directly, so that Verity was obliged to cross the whole length of the room to take it from her outstretched fingers, the way a dog is made to retrieve a stick simply to prove that it will. "You are going on a journey." "A journey to where, precisely?" "To Blackthorn Hall, of course." "To the Duke." Isabel, who was 22 and had spent 4 seasons failing to secure so much as a baronet's second son, let out a small, delighted laugh behind the rim of her teacup, as though her mother had just announced an especially amusing piece of theatre. Cecily, younger and considerably crueler, did not bother to disguise her smile at all. She simply watched Verity's face with the frank, hungry attention of a girl who had never once in her life been made to feel small and wished very much to see how it looked on someone else. "The Duke of Blackthorn does not receive," Verity said carefully, folding the letter she had not yet been permitted to read against the inside of her wrist. "Everyone in 3 counties knows that much." "He will receive it, surely." Lady Beatrice tapped the letter with one gloved finger, still smiling. "I have written to inform His Grace that his most devoted admirer, a young woman of quiet virtue who has worshipped him from afar since his return from the war, is prepared to present herself at his door, entirely of her own will, entirely without shame, prepared to become his bride, or should he prefer it, something rather less respectable. I signed it in your name, of course. It would hardly do to sign my own." The room went very still, the particular stillness Verity had learned to recognize as the moment before a trap finished closing. She understood in that stillness precisely what was being built around her, brick by careful brick, the way she understood every scheme her stepmother had ever assembled, not out of any special cleverness on her own part, but out of 9 years' practice reading the woman's face the way a sailor reads weather. Julian Voss, Duke of Blackthorn, had returned from the peninsula 4 years past with a ruined leg, a temper the London papers described as ungovernable, and a grief so total that he had not danced, dined, or so much as bowed to a marriageable woman since his father's sudden death, sent the title crashing down onto shoulders that had never once wanted to carry it. He turned earls away at his gates. He had, according to the gossip columns Cecily devoured with something close to religious fervour, once thrown a bishop's nephew bodily off his property for arriving uninvited to discuss a hunting matter. A man built along those lines, presented with an unsolicited declaration of devotion from a penniless stepdaughter, he had never once laid eyes upon, would not offer marriage. He would offer fury, precisely the sort of fury that could be shaped afterward into the ugliest kind of gossip. And Lady Beatrice knew this as surely as she knew the price of lace, because that was the entire design. "You want him to throw me out entirely," Verity said quietly, understanding the shape of it fully now. "I want the whole of the ton to hear, by Thursday next, that my late husband's charity case tried to force herself upon a duke and was sent home in disgrace." Lady Beatrice's voice had lost all its cruelty now and settled into the flat, satisfied efficiency of a woman balancing her household accounts. "After that, no one will ask why I have not brought you out. No one will wonder why you have no dowry, no prospects, no future to speak of at all. You will simply be the mad girl who chased a duke and was refused, and you will remain in this house, keeping my ledgers and mending my daughter's hems and managing my correspondence, for exactly as long as I find it convenient to keep you. It is, if you think on it honestly, a rather elegant solution to a problem that has troubled me for the better part of a decade. And if I refuse to go, then I will send you north with nothing at all, and you may explain to whichever parish takes pity on you why a gentlewoman of good family is begging along the road to Yorkshire in the middle of October." Lady Beatrice returned her attention to her tea as though the matter were entirely, permanently settled, because as far as she was concerned, it already was. "The hired carriage leaves within the hour. Take your grey cloak, the wool one, not the good one. It is going to rain the entire way, and I have no intention of replacing a cloak ruined on an errand that costs me nothing and gains me everything." It was, in fact, already raining by the time the hired carriage rattled out past the gates of Merrow House, and it did not stop for the better part of 2 days. Verity sat with her spine unbent against the cracked leather seat and watched Hertfordshire dissolve into a smear of wet green hedgerow, then the flatter, harder country of the Midlands, and finally the black moorland that surrounded Blackthorn Hall like a moat no polite army would willingly cross. She had 4 shillings sewn into the lining of her cloak, a single change of linen wrapped in brown paper, and a letter she had not been permitted to read, sealed with her stepmother's crest and addressed, in Lady Beatrice's elegant, deceitful hand, to His Grace the Duke of Blackthorn. She was 23 years old, though her eyes, when she caught her own reflection in the rain-streaked glass, belonged to a woman a decade older. She had spent 9 of those years learning that the fastest way to survive a house that did not want her was to make herself useful and invisible in equal measure. To take up as little space and cause as little inconvenience as a person could manage while still technically existing. And she turned that same cold discipline now toward the thing waiting for her at the end of the road. Because there was nothing else left to be done with it. She could not outrun a scandal with 4 shillings sewn into a hem. She could only walk into it standing upright. And so that was precisely what she intended to do, she thought. Somewhere past the second night's coaching in of her father, who had died believing his second wife would love his daughter as her own, and of the particular grief of discovering, slowly and then all at once, that a promise made in a sick room is not always a promise that survives the funeral. She did not cry over it any longer. She had cried over it at 14 and at 15, and then, quite suddenly, she had stopped, the way a wound stops bleeding once it has bled all it has to give. And what was left after that was simply endurance, patient and unglamorous. The only inheritance her father had managed to leave her, that no one else could take away. Blackthorn Hall announced itself first as a smell. Wet stone and peat smoke carried down off the moor on a hard wind, and then as a shape rising out of the mist, low and enormous, built of dark millstone grit gone nearly black with 2 centuries of northern weather. There were no ornamental gardens to soften the approach. There was no gravel sweep raked into elegant patterns for admiring carriages. The drive was simply mud, rutted deep by cartwheels and hoofprints, and the house at the end of it looked less like a ducal seat than a fortress that had never quite been persuaded to stop expecting a siege. The driver would go no further than the bottom of the steps, muttering something about the state of the road and his own supper waiting for him elsewhere. Verity paid him her last 3 shillings, watched the carriage lurch away into the rain until its lamps disappeared entirely into the grey, and climbed the wide stone stairs alone, her boots already soaked through to the stocking. The letter clutched inside her cloak to keep the ink from running. The knocker was iron, shaped like a wolf's head worn nearly smooth by generations of hands before her own. She lifted it and let it fall, and the sound rolled away into the house like something dropped down a very deep well, waiting a long moment to be answered by an echo that never quite came. It was some while before the door opened. The man who opened it was tall, silver-haired, dressed in unrelieved black, and he looked at Verity, at her dripping cloak, her mud-caked hem, the letter clenched in her white-knuckled hand, with the particular, weathered patience of a servant who has spent decades serving as the first line of defense against a difficult and demanding world. "His Grace is not receiving," he said, in the tone of a man who had delivered that exact sentence 1,000 times and expected to deliver it 1,000 more. "I am aware," Verity said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which surprised her more than it seemed to surprise him. "I have a letter for him." "I am not a caller, Mr. Pruitt. Mr. Pruitt, I am a delivery, nothing more." "You may take the letter from me now, or you may leave me standing on these steps until I am no longer capable of standing at all. At which point the delivering will become considerably more difficult a task for both of us, and I suspect neither of us wishes to discover exactly how difficult." Pruitt regarded her for a long moment, his gaze moving once, slowly, from her face to her ruined boots and back again. Something in his expression shifted very slightly, not quite warmth, but the flat, professional recognition of a woman who had clearly weighed her own remaining dignity against the weather and found, against considerable odds, that the weather was losing. He stepped back and led her into the hall. The inside of Blackthorn Hall was dim and vast, lit by candles that seemed to lose their argument with the shadows before they had properly begun it. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and beeswax polish applied with more duty than enthusiasm, and somewhere far off a dog barked twice, was answered by a low, irritable voice, and fell silent. Pruitt left her standing on the cold flagstones, water pooling slowly around her boots and spreading in a dark ring across the stone, while he carried the letter away down a long corridor with the resigned tread of a man walking toward an explosion he did not expect to prevent. She waited perhaps a quarter of an hour, long enough for the chill to work its way fully into her bones, long enough for her hands, clasped tightly at her waist, to begin very slightly to shake. She had catalogued her defenses on the long journey north the way another woman might have counted her jewels before a robbery. She had silence. She had stillness, and she had 9 years of practice standing perfectly composed while other people decided, at their leisure, what ought to be done with her. She called on all three now and held them close. When Pruitt returned, he did not carry a tray of polite regrets. He simply gestured for her to follow, and led her down a corridor lined with portraits so old the painted faces had gone the uniform color of strong tea, to a set of heavy double doors, where he knocked once and announced, "A Miss Merrow, Your Grace," before opening the door without waiting to be told he might. The study beyond was enormous, book-lined from floor to a ceiling lost somewhere in shadow, dominated by a fire fighting a losing battle against the sheer size of the room around it. Behind a desk buried under a landslide of ledgers sat a man who did not look up. His shirt was unbuttoned at the throat, his sleeves shoved carelessly to the elbow, and his dark hair looked as though it had been dragged through by an impatient hand more than once already that morning. He was writing, hard and fast, the quill scratching a furious path across the page. "Leave it on the desk, Pruitt," he said without lifting his eyes. His voice was low, rough at the edges, the voice of a man who did not use it any more than he strictly had to. "And build up that fire properly this time. It's like a tomb in here. It is not a letter that walked itself in." "Your Grace," Pruitt said, with the faint, dry patience of a man long accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "It is the lady herself." The quill stopped mid-word. He looked up slowly, and Verity, standing in the doorway with rainwater still dripping steadily from the hem of her cloak onto the priceless old rug beneath her feet, met the gaze of Julian Voss, Duke of Blackthorn, for the first time in her life. His eyes were a pale, startling gray, the color of water trapped beneath thick winter ice, and there was a thin white scar running from beneath his left ear down into the dark stubble along his jaw. He looked at her the way a man looks at a puzzle someone has set uninvited on his desk while his back was turned. He set his pen down with a small, deliberate click. He rose. He was tall, wide through the shoulders in a way his half-buttoned shirt did nothing to disguise. And when he came around the edge of the desk, she saw the drag in his right leg, the small, careful unevenness of a man who had spent a great deal of effort teaching himself not to wince in front of witnesses. He did not reach for the letter at all. He walked past her instead, to the hearth, and took hold of a heavy leather wing-back chair, dragging it, its legs shrieking hard against the stone, directly in front of the fire. Then he turned, pointed one long, ink-stained finger at the seat, and said the only words he had spoken to her yet, "Sit. Now please, before you catch your death and force me to explain your funeral to whoever sent you here." Verity blinked at him. "Your Grace, the letter will still say precisely whatever it says in 5 minutes," he said. "And you are dripping on my floor and turning a rather alarming shade of blue about the mouth. And I have no particular wish to explain to a coroner why a strange woman expired in my study before I had even the chance to read her correspondence properly. Sit down, Miss Merrow. Miss Merrow, sit." No one had offered Verity a chair in 9 years. She had stood behind Lady Beatrice's chair at 100 dinners without complaint. She had stood in the dressmaker's parlour while Isabel's hems and Cecily's sleeves were pinned to perfection around her, invisible in the corner. She had stood in doorways and at the edges of rooms that were never once built to hold her weight or her opinion. Her legs, aching and half numb with cold, betrayed her pride before her mind had properly finished deciding what to do about the offer. And she crossed to the chair and sank into it. And the heat of the fire hit her like a physical blow, so that she shook harder for a long moment before the shaking began, gradually, mercifully to ease. The Duke watched her with an unreadable stillness, arms folded, weight braced against the mantel, and then held out his hand, palm up, without another word of preamble. Verity drew the letter from beneath her cloak, the paper gone soft and slightly damp at its edges, and set it in his waiting palm. His fingers, when they briefly grazed hers, were warm and rough with ink and old calluses, startlingly so for a man of his rank. He broke the seal with his thumb, unfolded the pages, and read. She watched his face for the moment it would surely change, for the curl of disgust, the flare of the temper the gossip columns had built entire careers reporting on, and it did not come. He read the first page slowly. He turned to the second without hurrying. When at last he finished, he folded the letter back along its original creases with a strange, deliberate precision, and studied her over the top of it for a long moment before he finally spoke. "Your stepmother," he said slowly, "is a woman of considerable imagination." "She is a cruel woman, Your Grace," Verity said, her chin lifting a fraction despite the exhaustion pressing down on her. "The imagination merely does her dirty work for her, so that her own hands remain clean." Something that was almost a laugh, rusty and startled, broke out of him, gone as quickly as it arrived. "She writes here that you have adored me from a distance for years, that you have wept over a miniature of me you do not, in point of fact, possess, because no such miniature has ever existed, that your family can no longer bear to watch you pine, and begs me to take you off their hands as bride, or, should I find the former too great an inconvenience, as something considerably less respectable." He set the letter down on the small table beside her chair with 2 fingers, as though it might still be damp with something other than rain. "She expected me to fly into a rage and have you thrown bodily into the road before nightfall. She expected you to provide the scandal, Your Grace. I was merely the delivery, sent to be broken open at your convenience. And what precisely did you expect, walking up my drive in that condition?" "I expected shouting," Verity said. "I did not expect a chair." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his guarded face seemed to loosen very slightly, though his voice, when he spoke again, remained flat and unhurried. "I am a man of my reputation in most respects, Miss Merrow, but I do not perform rage on command for women looking to entertain their tea circles at my expense, and I do not suffer petty cruelty gladly, however cleverly it is dressed." He straightened, walked to the bell pull hanging beside the mantel and rang it hard. "Which means, unfortunately for your stepmother's plans, that we are about to sit down and write a letter of our own." Pruitt brought tea within minutes, and behind him a footman staggered slightly under a tray heavy enough to require both hands, laden with cold beef, thick bread, and a wedge of sharp cheese that Verity had not tasted the equal of in years. She made herself a small, careful plate, because pride demanded restraint even where hunger demanded something considerably less dignified. And the Duke, without glancing up from the ledger he had already reopened, said only, "Eat properly, Miss Merrow. I have no patience whatsoever for false delicacy at my own table, and the dogs get quite enough scraps as it is without your contribution." She ate. He worked in silence for the better part of 20 minutes, granting her the peculiar dignity of being entirely ignored while she did it. And when she finally set her cup down, he closed the ledger with a soft thud and studied her with the same clinical, unhurried attention he might have given a column of disputed figures. "Tell me about your stepmother's household," he said. "All of it. I find I have a professional interest in understanding precisely what sort of woman sends her stepdaughter to be ruined by strangers before breakfast," she told him. She told him of her father's death and the debts he had never known he was leaving behind him, of the household accounts she had kept faithfully since she was 16, because no one else in the house could be trusted with an honest column of figures. Of the estate manager Lady Beatrice had dismissed for economy's sake, whose duties had quietly, unpaidly, become Verity's own alongside the mending and the dinners and the 9 years of patient standing. She told him, when he asked her directly, and without softening the question, that she was good with numbers. Precise, she corrected him, not merely careful, and there was a difference. And when he asked her to prove it, she picked up a stray ledger from the corner of his desk without waiting to be formally invited. And within a quarter hour found an error in his own household accounts that had been quietly bleeding some £40 a year out of his kitchens. Through an overcharging grocer in the village below, he sat back in his chair and looked at her the way a man looks at a locked door that has just, unexpectedly and without ceremony, swung open of its own accord. "My steward left me a fortnight past," he said, "caught with his hand in the estate's purse for the better part of 3 years, and gone before I could do more than break his nose for the trouble. The books on that desk are a considerable disaster spanning 2 counties, and I despise paperwork nearly as much as I despise London and every soul who lives there. Are you offering me a position, Your Grace? I am offering you a way to disappoint your stepmother considerably more thoroughly than she ever intended to disappoint you." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "If I send you home tonight, she wins entirely, and the joke lands precisely as she designed it. If instead I keep you here as my clerk, my ledger keeper, whatever plain, unglamorous title you find least objectionable, she cannot claim you were refused, and she cannot claim you were ruined, because you will have honest wages, an honest roof, and honest work. And there will be nothing left for her gossip to attach itself to but her own poor judgment in sending you here in the first place." He paused. "I will write to her myself this afternoon. I will thank her with quite excessive warmth for so generously recommending her stepdaughter's talents to my household. I imagine that particular letter will do her a great deal more damage in London than any scandal she hoped to invent at your expense." Verity's hands, folded tightly in her lap, had gone very still. "And my wages, Your Grace? £40 a year, a room with a fire that will not go cold on my account, and my absolute indifference to whatever the Ton chooses to say about either of us afterward." A faint, reluctant curve touched the corner of his mouth, the first thing resembling a smile she had seen on him. "You will find I am considerably better company than my reputation suggests, provided you do not expect me to dance, sing, or feel anything at all about the opera, which I am told is the correct occupation of a gentleman, and which I have never once managed to summon interest in. I have never once wished to discuss the opera." "Your Grace, then I believe," Julian Voss said, and something in his pale eyes eased for the first time since she had entered the room, "that we shall get along very well indeed. Miss Merrow." The room they gave her that first night was in the older part of the house, small, plain, smelling faintly of dried lavender and undisturbed dust. And when Verity woke the next morning beneath a heavy wool blanket, she lay still for a long moment trying to name the feeling pressing gently against her chest. It took her several minutes to recognize it, so unfamiliar had it become, as safety. No bell rang for her. No voice called her name in that particular tone that meant a hem had come loose, or a temper needed careful managing before it broke over someone else's head. There was only the sound of an axe splitting wood somewhere below her window, and the distant, indifferent cry of moorland birds wheeling over ground that had never once been asked to be beautiful and had simply gone on existing anyway. She found her way down to the study by 7:30 the next morning, navigating a corridor she had only half memorized the night before, and found the Duke already at his desk, a great grey-brown wolfhound sprawled heavily across his boots, lifting its head to fix her with a slow, assessing stare before its master murmured, without looking up, "Quiet, Bran, she is the new clerk. And eating her would only mean more paperwork for the both of us," and the beast subsided with a heavy put-upon sigh. A second, smaller desk had been set up overnight in the corner of the room, bare but for 3 towering stacks of leather-bound account books, a fresh block of ink, and a dozen newly sharpened quills laid out with a precision that suggested someone had taken care over the arrangement. "Where would you like me to begin, Your Grace?" "The tenant records for 1809, he said, not glancing up from his own paper. "I suspect my late steward was pocketing the wool profits and marking the flocks as diseased to cover the shortfall. Prove it or disprove it, Miss Marrow. I have no interest whatsoever in fiction dressed up as fact in my accounts. Only in the plain, unwelcome truth of the numbers." She opened the first book, and the silence that settled over the room afterward was unlike any silence she had known in her stepmother's house. There, quiet had always meant that someone was listening at a door, waiting patiently to catch her at fault. Here it was simply the sound of 2 people occupied honestly with their own separate work. And by noon she had found her first discrepancy, and by the end of the week she had found 11 more, each one laid out on his desk with a short, precise note explaining exactly how the theft had been managed and by whom. And the Duke had stopped being surprised each time and started instead to look faintly, grimly satisfied, the way a man looks when an old wound he has been quietly carrying begins, at last unexpectedly to close. Beyond the study, the house itself began slowly to reveal its own rhythms to her. Mrs. Whitcomb, the grim-faced, sharp-eyed housekeeper, who had at first regarded Verity with the flat suspicion of a woman who had seen a great many hopeful strangers pass through Blackthorn's gates and come to no good end, softened by degrees once she understood that the new clerk asked for nothing beyond what her position strictly earned her, and expected no special deference for a name that carried in truth no particular weight of its own. It was Mrs. Whitcomb who first showed Verity the kitchen gardens gone half to ruin behind the east wall, and the linen presses that had not been properly aired in a decade. And it was Mrs. Whitcomb, over a shared pot of strong tea one wet afternoon, who told her, carefully, in the manner of a woman offering information she judged useful rather than gossip she judged entertaining, about Lady Iris, and the carriage, and the silence that had followed it. On a wet Sunday afternoon, with no ledgers pressing and the Duke gone to inspect a flooded culvert on the eastern boundary, Verity ventured for the first time into the long gallery above the great hall, where generations of Voss faces looked down from their frames with the same pale, watchful eyes she had come to know in their present owner. Mrs. Whitcomb found her there some while later, standing before a portrait of a stern, broad-shouldered man in an old-fashioned coat, and offered, unprompted, the story Verity had not yet worked up the courage to ask for directly. "The old Duke," Mrs. Whitcomb said, folding her hands over her apron, "His Grace's father, a hard man, by most accounts, though not an unkind one, only tired in the particular way men of his generation were tired, from holding up more than one house, was ever meant to bear alone. He never expected the title to come to Master Julian at all. It was young Master Edmund who was raised for it, the elder son, groomed from the cradle for exactly this house and exactly this weight, while his younger brother was left largely to his own devices and, I believe, was glad enough of the neglect at the time. And what became of Master Edmund? Fever, madam. The winter before the old Duke followed him into the ground within the same 12-month. Grief doing what fever could not quite finish on its own, or so the servants below stairs have always said, and I have never found particular cause to doubt them." Mrs. Whitcomb's sharp eyes softened just slightly on the portrait. "His Grace came home from the war already half ruined in body, and found the title waiting for him besides. A house and 2 counties of tenants he had never once been trained to manage, and a sister gone silent with grief in the same season. It is little wonder, madam, that he shut the gates and stopped receiving anyone at all. I have served this family 30 years, and I have never once seen him look at a task the way he looks at your ledgers of a morning. Content, I should call it, though he would deny the word to my face if I ever dared use it in front of him." Verity said nothing to this, though she carried it with her back down the stairs, turning it over the way she turned over a stubborn column of figures, until the shape of it settled into something she understood rather better than she had before. That the man who had offered her a chair before he had said a single word of greeting had spent the whole of his adult life being handed weight he had never asked to carry, and had simply, without complaint, learned to carry it anyway. It was not so very different, she thought, from her own inheritance. 3 weeks passed in this fashion. Ledgers and firelight, and the particular, unhurried companionship of 2 people who felt no obligation whatsoever to fill a silence simply for the sake of filling it. It was on a Wednesday, when the post arrived late off the moor road, that Verity first met Lady Iris properly. She came into the study without knocking, a slight, pale girl of perhaps 16 with her brother's same startling grey eyes set into a considerably softer face, and stopped dead in the doorway at the sight of a stranger seated at the small corner desk. She did not speak. She had not spoken. Verity would learn that same evening from Mrs. Whitcomb over the strong tea that had become something of a ritual between them. Not one word since the carriage accident 3 years past that had killed their father on the ice road above the village, and left the girl with nothing outwardly broken but a silence, no. Physicians summoned from as far as York had ever been able to properly explain. "Let alone mend, Iris," the Duke said gently, in a voice Verity had not yet heard him use for anyone, softened at its rough edges in a way that suggested a tenderness he kept carefully hidden from the rest of the world. "This is Miss Marrow. She has come to save me from my own accounts, and so far she is winning the argument decisively." Iris studied Verity for a long moment with an intensity that reminded her, uncomfortably, of standing in a doorway, being silently assessed for her usefulness by someone who held all the power in the exchange. Then, unexpectedly, the girl crossed the room, picked up a spare quill from the corner desk without asking, and wrote 3 words on a scrap of paper before sliding it across the surface toward Verity. "Do you read?" "Constantly," Verity said, matching the girl's gravity rather than performing false cheer at her, which she suspected would have been received as an insult. "Though I confess I have had very little worth reading for some years beyond household accounts and my stepsister's fashion plates, which I do not recommend to anyone with a genuine appetite for literature." Something in Iris's face, not quite a smile, but its careful, wary cousin flickered and, for a moment, held. She wrote one further line beneath the first, more slowly this time, as though weighing each word before committing it to the page. "Mother used to read to me. Before." Verity did not press her to explain what she meant by that single word standing alone at the end of the sentence, only nodded and reached for the book resting nearest her own hand, and began without further comment to read aloud from wherever the page happened to fall open, as though it were the most ordinary request in the world, rather than the first door Iris had opened to anyone outside her own family in 3 long years. From that day forward she came to the study most mornings, curling herself into the deep window seat with a book while Verity worked through the tenant ledgers. And though she said nothing aloud for weeks yet, she began, slowly, to write more. Full sentences, careful questions about the books Verity recommended to her. Once memorably, a rather scathing written opinion of a popular novel that made the Duke, reading it over Verity's shoulder uninvited, laugh so suddenly and so hard that Bran startled fully awake and knocked over the coal scuttle, scattering ash across the good rug, in a way that sent Mrs. Whitcomb into a fortnight of pointed remarks about the general conduct of the household. It was in December, when the damp cold settled fully into the old stone walls and refused entirely to lift, that Verity learned the true price of the Duke's leg. She noticed the change first in the way he held himself at breakfast, the careful, deliberate stillness of a man bracing hard against something he refused, on principle, to name aloud. By mid-morning his face had gone grey beneath its usual weathered colour. His breathing had turned shallow and controlled, and when he attempted to rise from his desk, his leg buckled entirely beneath him, sending him hard against the edge of it, with a sound that was considerably more curse than cry. Verity did not send for Pruitt. She went instead to the hearth, selected a smooth, flat stone kept warming permanently near the coals for exactly this purpose, wrapped it swiftly in a length of flannel she found draped over the wood basket, and poured 3 fingers of brandy from the decanter on the sideboard. She carried both to him and set the glass down in front of his clenched fist. "Drink," she said. It was not a request, and she did not phrase it as one. "Leave me be." "Verity!" It was the first time he had used her Christian name in the whole of their acquaintance, and it came out ragged, entirely stripped of its usual composure. "No." She crossed her arms and held his glare without flinching from it, because she had spent 9 years standing unmoved in front of considerably crueler faces than his own. "You are useless to me, doubled over your own desk, and I have several urgent questions about the wool merchant's account that cannot wait upon your pride." "Drink the brandy, your grace." He glared at her a moment longer, and then slowly, his hand uncurled from where it had been gripping his own thigh. He drank the brandy in one hard swallow and coughed against the burn of it. She knelt beside his chair without waiting to be granted permission, and pressed the warm, flannel-wrapped stone firmly against the outside of his ruined knee, and felt him go rigid beneath her hands, and then gradually, by degrees, begin to loosen. "Shrapnel," he said eventually, his eyes closed, his voice thick with the brandy and the slow ebbing of the pain. "They took out what they could of it at the time, but the bone never healed clean. The damp makes it feel some days as though it is happening all over again, as though the whole business were only just now finishing. My father had gout. In his final years," Verity said quietly, keeping her hands steady against the stone, "he would scream if the bedsheet so much as brushed against his foot in the night. We used hot bricks then, much like this one, though I have never once understood the physic of why it helps. I am not screaming, Miss Merrow. You were considering it rather seriously, Your Grace, before I arrived with the brandy." He opened his eyes then and looked down at her, kneeling on the cold stone floor in her plain grey dress, her hands steady where they held the warmth against his leg. "You ought to have gone straight back to your stepmother's house the moment I first offered you the choice of it," he said, low and rough. "Instead, you are here on your knees in a freezing study, pressing hot stones to a crippled man's leg as though it were the most ordinary task in the world." "In your stepmother's house," Verity said, meeting his eyes fully. "I was a joke, sent north to be laughed at and thrown away at your convenience. Here, I find I am necessary to the accounts if nothing else. I do not regret the trade, Your Grace, and I would ask that you not insult me by suggesting I should." He was quiet for a long moment, something in the air between them shifting, some old, careful distance closing by a small but unmistakable fraction. He reached down and his rough, ink-stained hand came to rest very briefly, against the side of her face, his thumb tracing once along the line of her jaw before he seemed to catch himself and drew the hand back, as though he had surprised even himself with the gesture. "You're not a joke, Verity," he said quietly. "Not here, and not to me." Winter deepened around Blackthorn Hall, and with it settled the strange, steady rhythm of a household that had, without either of them quite pausing to name it aloud, become something considerably more than a plain arrangement between employer and clerk. Iris began, in the raw early days of February, to speak again, haltingly at first. A single small word offered across the breakfast table to Verity alone, and then, by the middle of March, whole hesitant sentences that made Mrs. Whitcomb weep openly into her apron the first time she overheard one drift down the corridor from the study. The Duke no longer barked when Verity corrected his arithmetic in the margins of his own letters. He merely pushed the inkwell an inch closer to her side of the desk and waited, without comment, for her to finish. There were small excursions, too, as the weather allowed. Verity rode out with him one bright, cold morning in late February to inspect a collapsed stretch of tenant fencing on the western boundary, and found herself, for the first time in 9 years, laughing openly at something a man had said, when he observed with perfect gravity that the sheep responsible for the collapse ought by rights to be billed directly for the repair. She began, without quite deciding to know the names of the tenant families along the moor road, the Hartleys, whose eldest boy had a gift for figures that reminded her uncomfortably of her own younger self, and old Mrs. Prynne, who kept bees and pressed a jar of dark heather honey into Verity's hands every time she rode past, refusing all payment with the flat. Immovable stubbornness of a woman twice Lady Beatrice's age, and considerably more generous. It was on one such visit, to the small market town at the foot of the moor, that Verity first encountered Mrs. Ashcombe, wife of the county's leading squire, a woman with a sharp eye for social arithmetic nearly as precise as Verity's own for the household kind. Mrs. Ashcombe had heard, of course, that the Duke had taken on a female clerk of obscure origin, and she made a point of stopping Verity outside the draper's shop to inquire, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, exactly what sort of position a respectable young woman imagined she was occupying, alone in a bachelor's house, however plainly she dressed, or however early she rose to her ledgers. "An honest one, madam," Verity said evenly, "which I find is considerably more than most of the county can claim for its own arrangements. However respectably, those arrangements may be dressed in the proper linen." Mrs. Ashcombe's smile thinned further still. "You are very bold, for a woman of no particular fortune or family, to speak so plainly to your betters," Mrs. Ashcombe said, drawing herself up a full inch taller, as though the added height might lend the observation more weight than it otherwise carried. "I have found plain speaking wears a good deal better than the alternative, madam, and costs considerably less to maintain besides, in my experience of households far less fortunate than your own." Verity dropped a small, correct curtsy, precisely the depth propriety required and not 1 degree further, and continued on her way toward the draper's without hurrying her step, though her heart beat hard and fast beneath her composure the whole length of the street. If her hands shook slightly once she was safely out of sight around the corner, she told no one of it, least of all the Duke, who she suspected rightly would have ridden directly to the Ashcombe estate that same afternoon to say something considerably less measured on her behalf, and she had no wish to see him spend his goodwill in the county defending a slight. She was perfectly capable of turning aside on her own account. There was a night, late in that same February, when the weather turned with no warning at all, a hard wind coming down off the high moor and bringing sleet with it thick enough to blot out the stable lamps from the house windows entirely. Verity had gone up to her room early, and it was Mrs. Whitcomb's frantic knock. Some hour later, that brought her back down the stairs at a run, her wrapper half fastened, her heart already hammering before she had heard a single word of explanation. "Lady Iris, madam." "She is not in her room, nor the library, nor anywhere in the house that any of us have yet searched, and her cloak is gone from its peg." They found the Duke already in the front hall, half into his riding coat, his face set into the particular grey stillness Verity had learned to recognize as fear disguised as competence. "She does this," he said, low, more to himself than to either woman. "Or she did, in the year just after the accident. Walks out to the old chapel ruin on the ridge where our mother is buried. I had thought she had stopped. Then I am coming with you," Verity said, already reaching for her own cloak from the stand by the door. "You will do no such thing in this weather." "I will do precisely that." "Your Grace, because you cannot manage that leg on frozen ground in the dark without help, and because Iris knows my voice now nearly as well as she knows yours, and because you have not the time to argue the point with me while she is out there alone." She was already tying her cloak as she spoke, and something in her flat, immovable certainty made him stop arguing entirely and simply nod once, and lead the way out into the sleet. The walk to the ridge took the better part of half an hour against the wind, Julian's lantern throwing a small, wavering circle of light across ground gone treacherous with ice, his bad leg buckling twice on the uneven turf before Verity took his arm without asking and simply held it, matching her pace to his without comment on either side. They found Iris at last huddled against the broken chapel wall, soaked through, shaking too hard to write on the slate she carried now instead of paper, but alive, and entirely unhurt beyond the cold. I wanted to tell her, Iris managed at last. Once they had her wrapped in Julian's own coat and moving back toward the house between them, her voice thin and broken by shivering. About Miss Merrow. I wanted to tell Mother that someone finally stays. Julian said nothing for a long moment, his jaw tight, and then he simply pulled his sister closer against his side and kept walking. And Verity, on Iris's other side, matched their pace and said nothing at all, because there was nothing that wanted saying that the silence itself was not already saying better. It was Mrs. Whitcomb, waiting anxiously at the door with hot bricks and dry blankets, who wept openly at the sight of all three of them stumbling in out of the sleet together. And it was Verity who sat by Iris's bed until dawn, reading aloud in a low, steady voice until the girl's shivering finally eased into ordinary sleep. And it was Julian, standing quietly in the doorway near midnight, who watched her do it with an expression she did not see, because her attention was entirely elsewhere, and would not have recognized even had she seen it, as the exact moment he stopped merely tolerating his own house and started, instead, to think of it as something worth defending. It could not, of course, last undisturbed for long. On a raw Tuesday in early spring, the sound of a carriage rattling hard up the drive brought Pruitt hurrying to the study door, with an expression Verity had, by now, learned to read as trouble arriving faster than good manners could prepare for it. Lady Beatrice Merrow, Your Grace, and a gentleman she introduces as her cousin. The doors were thrown open before Pruitt had finished the sentence, before he had even properly stepped aside. Lady Beatrice swept into the room wrapped in traveling velvet the color of a fresh bruise. Her face powdered into a mask of righteous fury, a thin, overdressed man trailing behind her whom Verity recognized, with a sinking feeling low in her chest, as her stepmother's cousin, Mr. Vance, a man who had spent his whole adult life living comfortably on the scraps of other people's fortunes. So, Lady Beatrice said, her eyes sweeping the room and landing with cold and deliberate precision on Verity's ink-stained fingers and plain grey dress, seated openly at her own small desk beside the Duke's. It is exactly as they say in London, then. You have made my stepdaughter your companion. The word landed like a slap, disguised, very thinly as courtesy. The Duke did not rise from his chair. He regarded Lady Beatrice the way a man regards a fox that has wandered uninvited onto his land and appears to believe it has some claim there. Lady Beatrice, you are tracking mud onto my floor and interrupting honest work, and neither offense particularly recommends you to my patience this morning. I am here for justice, Your Grace. Her voice rose, pitched carefully for maximum effect. You have ruined this girl's reputation and, by extension, the marriage prospects of my own daughters, who cannot secure a single respectable offer while your name is linked to hers in every drawing room from here to London and back again. Your daughter's prospects, the Duke said flatly, are not my particular concern, and were, if I'm not mistaken, considerably damaged long before I ever laid eyes on your stepdaughter, given the general reputation of this household for economy over honesty. He rose then, unhurried, and Verity saw the small, deliberate control with which he hid the weight he still favored off his bad leg, refusing to let the movement betray him in front of an enemy. I will say this once, and I would ask you to listen carefully, as I have no intention of repeating myself. Miss Merrow is in my employ, respectably housed, respectably paid, and entirely under my protection. If you have come seeking a settlement to smooth your own retreat from society, you may say so plainly, and I will consider it on its merits. If you have come merely to shout at me in my own study, I would ask you to do it somewhere that is not my study. Lady Beatrice's composure cracked, just slightly at the word settlement, and something calculating slid quickly into her expression, replacing the fury with a colder, more practical arithmetic. £10,000, she said, for the considerable damage done to my family's good name, and I will declare her dead to me publicly before witnesses, so that no further shame can attach itself to my daughters through her association. The room went very still. Verity felt the old, familiar dread rise slow and cold in her throat, 9 years of it, ready to close over her head the way it always had at the sound of her stepmother's particular tone of finality. The Duke crossed to his desk instead of answering her directly, opened the bottom drawer, and drew out a thick bundle of papers tied together with black ribbon. Papers Verity had seen him working over quietly, late into the evening, for the better part of a fortnight, without once explaining to her why. He set the bundle on the small table between them, with a heavy final thud that seemed to still every other sound in the room. "What is this?" Lady Beatrice demanded, her eyes narrowing. "Your promissory notes, Lady Beatrice. Every debt you currently owe to the dressmaker on Bond Street, to the wine merchant, and to the 3 separate money lenders in Cheapside, presently threatening to seize your furniture within the month. I purchased every one of them a fortnight ago, once I understood precisely what sort of visit I was eventually likely to receive from you." He untied the ribbon slowly, deliberately, and held the topmost note briefly over the nearest candle flame, letting the corner catch. "Which means, madam, that you do not set terms with me."
"You owe me."
"If you ever speak your stepdaughter's name again with anything less than respect, in this house or any other in England, I will call in every last shilling at once. And you and your daughters may explain your reduced circumstances to the governors of the fleet." Lady Beatrice's face drained entirely of color, the powder standing out stark and false against her sudden pallor. She looked, for the first time in the whole of Verity's memory of her, genuinely afraid. She gathered Mr. Vance with a single furious glance and left without another word, without so much as a backward glance at the stepdaughter she had traveled 2 days to reclaim. The sound of her carriage wheels churning away hard down the drive, fading slowly into the wet spring air until it disappeared entirely. The silence that followed was enormous, ringing faintly in Verity's ears the way silence does after a very loud noise has finally stopped. She found her hands were shaking and pressed them flat against the desk to steady them, the old habit reasserting itself before she had consciously decided to reach for it. "You did not need to buy her," she said finally, her voice rough with things she had not expected to feel. "I did not ask that of you, Your Grace. I would never have asked it. I know you did not ask it of me." He crossed the room to stand in front of her, closer than strict propriety allowed, his gray eyes steady and unguarded on hers in a way she had not yet seen from him. "She looked at you as though you were nothing at all. Verity, for 9 long years by your own account, and I find I am entirely tired, in general, of the world failing to see clearly what is standing directly in front of it. What is standing in front of it, Your Grace? You are the only quiet I have found anywhere since I came home from that war," he said, low and rough. "You are the woman who brings me hot stones instead of pity, who corrects my arithmetic without once flattering my pride in the process, who taught my sister to find her voice again simply by treating her silence as an ordinary thing rather than a tragedy requiring careful management. You are not a joke, Verity Merrow, and you have never once been a charity case beneath this roof. You are, I think, the entire reason I no longer dread coming down to this study each morning." He paused, and something uncertain moved across his usually guarded face. An odd vulnerability in a man otherwise built almost entirely of careful, defended angles. "I am asking you to stay, not as my clerk any longer, as my wife, if you will have me." Verity stared at him, searching his face for the trick in it, and finding none. "You swore to Pruitt, not a month past within my own hearing, that you would never marry. I swore that before a woman walked soaked to the skin into my study and told me she would rather freeze to death on my own front steps than be moved by force," he said. "Circumstances, I find, have altered rather considerably since that particular oath." He reached for her hands, ink-stained and steady even now, and held them both in his own. "I offer you my name, which will silence every remaining whisper your stepmother ever set loose into the world. I offer you a home in which you will never again have to stand simply because no one thought to set you a chair. And I offer you the plain, entirely unromantic truth that I would rather sit across a ledger from you for the whole of the rest of my life than dance a single dance with any other woman in England. That is not a very romantic proposal, Your Grace. I did warn you at the very outset of our acquaintance that I have no patience whatsoever for the opera." The corner of his mouth lifted, and for a moment the whole guarded weight of him seemed at last to ease entirely. "Marry me, Verity, stay." They were married 3 weeks later in the small stone chapel standing at the edge of the estate, with no grand guests summoned, and no London gossip permitted within 100 miles of the ceremony if either of them had anything to say about it. Verity did not wear white. She wore deep forest green, a colour the Duke had chosen himself and sent for specially from London without ever telling her why, until she understood, watching Iris weep happily into a handkerchief from the front pew, that it was simply a colour he had noticed he liked to see on her, and had wanted, in his own quiet way, to give her the choosing of it removed from her own hands for once, as a gift rather than an obligation. When the vicar pronounced them married, Julian did not offer a polite, chaste, public kiss of the sort custom demanded. He pulled her against him in front of the whole small, startled congregation and kissed her as though he had been waiting 3 long years for someone to finally grant him permission. Spring came fully to the moor not long afterward, turning the black winter heather a rich, generous green and the low grey sky at last, a soft and expansive blue that seemed to stretch on considerably further than Verity had ever imagined a sky could reach in Yorkshire. She sat one bright morning at the great oak desk in the study, her desk now, in every practical sense, since Julian had quietly and without comment moved his own papers to the smaller desk in the corner, claiming she required the additional space for her rapidly expanding filing system, reviewing the quarter's accounts, which showed for the first time in a decade a genuine and unambiguous surplus. Iris sat curled nearby in the deep window seat, reading aloud in a clear, steady, entirely unhesitant voice to Bran, who had by now adopted her with the same devoted, unwavering loyalty he had once reserved exclusively for his master alone. The study door opened. Julian came in from riding the northern boundary, mud still fresh on his boots, wind still tangled through his hair. The harsh lines that pain had once carved permanently around his mouth softened now, month by month, into something considerably closer to peace than Verity suspected he had known in all the years since his return from the war. He crossed to the desk and leaned his hip against its edge, entirely unconcerned with the mud he was transferring generously onto the good wood. "Auditing me again, Your Grace?" he asked, the old teasing gravel fully back in his voice. Warmer now than it had been the first time she had heard it. "Someone must," Verity said, tapping her pen against the open ledger. A slow smile spreading fully across a face that had long ago stopped hiding itself behind careful, protective stillness. "You have spent an alarming sum this quarter on new fencing for the western pasture alone. The sheep required it rather urgently, as I recall you agreeing yourself in February. The sheep required considerably less fencing than you appear to have purchased on their behalf, Your Grace, and I intend to say so at length in the margin of this ledger for posterity." He laughed, a full, unguarded sound that filled the whole wide room from wall to wall. The same rusty, startled laugh she had first heard from him on a rain-soaked afternoon 4 years past and had, quietly, in her own private accounting, come to treasure above every other sound the house had to offer, and reached down to pull her up out of her chair and fully into his arms. The ledgers, the accounts, the whole careful architecture of the morning's work entirely forgotten between one breath and the next. Iris looked up briefly from her book, rolled her eyes with the particular, practiced affection of a younger sister long since accustomed to this exact scene repeating itself, and returned without further comment to her reading, while outside the tall study windows the moor stretched green and endless toward a horizon that no longer looked, to any single one of them, anything at all like the edge of an exile. Verity rested her head against her husband's chest and listened to the steady, unhurried beat beneath it, and thought, not for the first time and likely not for the last, of the letter sealed with her stepmother's crimson wax, carried north with such careful, deliberate cruelty, meant only to deliver her into ruin before the season's end. It had been a cruel joke, meticulously built, brick by brick, to break her completely. But standing here now, in the one house in the whole of England that had ever thought to offer her a seat before it asked a single thing of her in return, she found in the end that she did not mind at all how the joke had finally turned out. 4 years passed in much the same steady rhythm, seasons turning over the moor like pages in a well-kept ledger, and Blackthorn Hall grew by slow and unremarkable degrees into a house that no longer resembled the fortress it had once braced itself to be. The kitchen gardens Mrs. Whitcomb had once tended alone now fed half the village in a lean winter, and the tenant cottages along the eastern boundary had new roofs against the damp. And Iris, grown tall and steady-voiced at 20, had taken to riding the northern fences herself most mornings, keeping records of the flocks in a neat, careful hand that Verity recognized, with no small pride, as an echo of her own. There was a child now, too. A dark-haired boy of 2 who had inherited his father's pale grey eyes and, to Julian's evident and unconcealed delight, his mother's flat refusal to be hurried through any task he had set his small mind to finishing properly. He was found most mornings under the great oak desk in the study, solemnly arranging wooden blocks into towers, he insisted, with considerable authority for a person not yet 3, were ledgers, while his parents worked above him and Bran, grey about the muzzle now but no less devoted, kept a slow, patient watch from his spot before the hearth. It was on just such a morning, with rain streaking soft and unhurried down the tall study windows, that a letter arrived from London bearing a familiar seal, and Verity broke it open at the desk without any of the old dread that name had once summoned in her. Lady Beatrice, it seemed, had retired quietly to a modest house in Bath some years past. Her daughters married off at last to men of unremarkable fortune and unremarkable temper, and the letter, brief and stiffly worded, requested nothing more than news of Verity's health and, in a single grudging line near its close, "Congratulations on the birth of an heir. She wants something," Julian said, reading over her shoulder without asking permission. "Exactly as he always had. She wants nothing at all this time, I think," Verity said, folding the letter and setting it aside without any particular weight attached to the gesture. "I believe she has simply run out of anyone else left to write to, and found she remembered my direction." She looked up at him, and found him watching her with the same steady, unguarded grey eyes that had first met hers across a rain-soaked study 4 years before, offering her a chair when the whole of the world had offered her nothing at all. "I find I do not need anything further from her, Your Grace. I have everything I once thought I would spend the whole of my life doing without." He said nothing to that, only reached down and drew her up out of her chair the way he always did, unhurried and entirely certain of his welcome. And outside the tall windows, the moor stretched on green and endless in the soft spring rain, holding, as it always had, considerably more warmth than anyone unfamiliar with it would ever have thought to expect, or than the young woman who had once arrived at its gates with 4 shillings and a stranger's cruel joke sewn into the lining of her cloak could ever quite have imagined for herself on that first cold, rain-drenched afternoon. If Verity and Julian's quiet, hard-won happiness warmed your heart tonight, please leave a like. Share this story with someone who loves a slow-burn romance worth waiting for. And subscribe so you never miss the next tale. We'll see you in the next chapter.